tell a little bit more about who I am because I have a very interdisciplinary background. So I started as an engineer. My first degree is in computer engineering. And then I went to do an MBA. And finally, when I came to CMU, and actually during my dissertation, I ended up doing psychology. So I'm a little bit of everything, but in my laboratory, what we mostly do is psychology and computer science together. And Carnegie Mellon in general is a university that is well known for the interdisciplinary kind of work. My laboratory, and you can see more information here, it's a very interdisciplinary laboratory, but mostly computer science and psychology. And after all this week of presentations, I kept thinking, how is my work gonna fit to this conference? And Immaculada told me, you present what you are going to present. Don't worry, because we want the variety, and also Herman. So what I prepared today is actually a set of experiments to tell you about dynamic systems, and in particular, the basic elements of dynamic tasks. What I do is I study dynamic decision making, and the way I see dynamic decision making is a human interacting with a system. The way we interact with the system and influence that system is through the decisions we make. And then the system influences us, humans, by feedback, by providing us the outcome or the results of the decisions we make. This system is dynamic. And we tend to think of systems as static often, but in reality, everything is constantly changing. This other system, which is the human mind, is also dynamic. We learn, and as we make decisions, we learn from the outcomes and from our experience and the past decisions we have made. So this represents what I do, what I study, decision-making in dynamic systems. But there are many, the concept of dynamic system is very general. What is it? Well, every system is dynamic, and in fact, it goes from the global to the organizational to the individual. The difference is that some systems change more rapidly, and other systems change more slowly. So let's think of climate. So climate is an extremely complex system, and many question whether humans are actually influencing that system. In my mind, there is absolutely no question about it. We are influencing that system through the decisions we make, whether we decide to walk every day instead of taking the public transport or our bikes, whether we decide to trash and pollute our oceans. We are absolutely influencing that system. But that system changes so slowly that it appears as if it was static. But it is not. In fact, what is happening now, and this happens in many complex systems, the increase is nonlinear. The majority of complex systems are nonlinear. So what we are now living is the rapid change of this system. And many think that we are not going to be able to go back to how it was, unfortunately. But now think of inventory control. Many of you come from, not from universities, but from companies. There are also dynamic systems in companies. Inventory control is one of them. In all of these systems, there is something that we call accumulations or stocks, okay? So a stock is an accumulation, in this case, accumulation of boxes or goods. But humans are influencing that accumulation through sales and supplies, right? And often our goal is to balance these systems. So the goal of humans is to maintain the best level of inventory. Of course, if we knew how much we were going to sell and how long it takes to supply, we probably would keep this in zero. But instead, we have a lot of accumulation of inventory in many companies, which is very costly, right? So now think of at the individual level. At the individual level, we have another dynamic system, our body. This is just an example, but there are many. So obesity is actually one of the biggest problems in the US. Why is that a problem? It's a problem of control again. It's very simple, right? What you eat and what you exercise. And this imbalance causes obesity. So why cannot we control all these systems? So many people would say, well, of course, because those systems are so complex, they are very difficult to control. But in reality, every dynamic system can be seen with the most essential elements, can be reduced to the most essential elements. These three examples that I showed you can be thought of as a bathtub. And in a bathtub, you have an inflow, you have an outflow, and you have an accumulation of water, right? This is a special kind of bathtub. You can imagine a bathtub that you can control the outflow, right? But still, it's as simple as this system. So humans indeed make choices to control. So we have two faucets to control here, the one of the inflow and the one of the outflow. And in fact, the behavior of all these systems is very simple. If the inflows are greater than the outflows, what's going to happen? Well, the accumulation or the stock is going to increase. If the outflows are greater than the inflows, the stock is going to fall, right? The only way in which we can control the inflows and the outflows is when the stock is when the inflows and the outflows are the same. The rate is the same. So it doesn't seem anything out of this world, right? It seems a very simple rule. But then it makes us question, why cannot we understand that the CO2 in the atmosphere is increasing? And what we need to do is look at absorptions and look at the emissions of CO2 and balance those two. That's what we are supposed to do, right? So when I show these kind of problems, a lot of people would say, well, but certainly humans don't overflow their bathtubs. We know how to control dynamic systems. Well, what I'm going to show you is evidence for many years of research that demonstrate that humans don't know how to control dynamic systems. This story started in 2000 with Sweeney and John Sterman. What John and Sweeney did was to provide this type of problems to MIT graduate students, okay? In this problem, you see that bathtub that I showed you, and this graph shows the outflow and the inflow, okay? So the outflow is fixed over time, and the inflow changes in this way, all right? And then he asked people to please draw the accumulation, the stock here, all right? And then this other example is very similar, but in this case is the cash flow. And the accumulation of cash is based on inflow and outflow, again, expenses and incomes. And again, this is the expenses and this is the incomes, right? And ask people to draw, okay? What he found, and I don't want to do the test to you, but you can try and see if you can draw the accumulation over time. In reality, what happens is that, what do you think is going to happen here? If the inflow is greater than the outflow, what happened to the stock? The inflow is greater than the outflow, increases. So the stock increases, and furthermore, increases linearly because the difference between inflow and outflow is constant. Okay? So the shape here is going up like this. Okay? And then going down, and etc. Now this one also, the inflow is greater than the outflow, but it's non-linear. So the shape here is like a curve, like this. Okay? So I just gave you the rules. The rules are very simple, right? Yet humans have difficulty understanding what happens with these very simple stuff. So what John and Butswini found is that 77% of people, all graduate students at MIT with backgrounds in mathematics and calculus and all that, only 77% did it correctly. And in this case, only 48% did it correctly. So this made them conclude that highly educated subjects with extensive training in mathematics and science have poor understanding of some of the most basic concepts of system dynamics, especially stocks and flows, time delays, and feedback. So I thought, wow, that's puzzling. And then I thought, well, certainly Carnegie Mellon students are not gonna make such mistakes. So what we did was design this task. So this task is the department store task. We call it like that, but in reality, it can be any system, any stock and any flows, right? So we gave a scenario in which imagine this department store, and these are the number of minutes in which people are entering or leaving the department store, inflow and outflow. And then we asked people 4 questions. Please answer the following questions. During which minute did the most people enter the store? During which minute did the most people leave the store? These questions are easy. I assume all of us can read graphs. So we look at entering, we look at the maximum point, and we answer that, right? We look at leaving, we look at the maximum point, and we answer that. So indeed, those are the answers, and we graded the answers with a plus or minus 1, rate of possibility of error. So yeah, we found that a lot of people are able to read graphs. But then we asked them, during which minute were the most people in the store? And during which minute were the least people in the store? So now we are asking about the accumulation of people in the store. Okay, anybody wants to guess? No. All right, so we need to think about accumulation in this case. So before this crossing point, more people are entering the store than leaving. So what is happening to the number of people in the store? It's increasing. After this, more people are leaving than entering. So what is happening to the number of people in the store is decreasing. So when were the most people in the store? Right here. Okay? When were the fewest people in the store? Well, if we look at the area between these 2 curves, this is actually twice, and it was designed that way, than this other area. So the least people in the store are here. Those were the answers. And in this case, we found 44% of correct answers for question 3 and 31 for question 4. The most common answer was this one. So people thought not of accumulation, but rather of one point on time, that the most people and the least people corresponding to a one-time difference between the inflows and the outflows. But that's incorrect. We need to think of accumulation, not at one point of time. So as I said, we thought, oh, CMU students need to do it well. Well, that started a whole program of research for me. I didn't do this research before 2007. That was the first, tell me when I need to stop. Okay. In 2007, when we decided to take this as a challenge and started to investigate, well, it's possible that people don't see the stores as an accumulation. How about bank? let's present the problem as this is the bank account and you have incomes and you have expenses. Everybody knows that, if you spend more than you receive, well, you don't have money in your bank account, right? If you earn more than you receive, you have more in your bank account. Sounds easy. So again, we did this, and basically it didn't matter. If it was a bank or a store, we see the proportion of people that did the last two questions correct was very low. So we thought about it's because the graph is very complex. How about we change the graph? Well, we did it with these very, very, very simple graphs. We have here the inflow and the outflows, and they change next to each other. We thought that was going to be very easy, and instead we found the same rates. It didn't matter if it was a line or a triangle, if it was easy or hard, very similar rates of accuracy. This paper, which is with John Sterman, I talked to John and with my students at that time, Matt Cronin, we decided to engage in figuring this out. This puzzle really bothered me, it's like we have to find out what it is. So we did a lot of different studies. Maybe it's low effort, maybe it's confusing information displays, blah, blah, blah. We did all these different studies. And here are some of them. So as you see, we are changing the number of points, thinking maybe people are actually trying to do the math in their minds, and if we reduce the number of points, that would make it easier. So now we presented 24 data points, and that made no difference for the last two questions. And as you see, it's not a matter of not knowing how to read the graphs. People know how to read the graphs. That's not the issue. Okay, well, graphs are not the right representation. Okay, let's do tables. Let's do bar graphs. Let's do text. And we did all those. And what you see here is the overall results, line and bar, table and text. There's no difference. Unfamiliar context, again, how about cars? How about the bathtub? Nobody overflows their bathtub. We did it with the bathtub too. There is no difference. Poor motivation. Okay, this started to be interesting for me because I thought, okay, well, we can try to do it by telling students in this case that we are going to compare their performance to MIT graduate students. And that's usually a good motivation for many students, especially in Carnegie Mellon too, but this was in GMU. This in particular was a sort of a learning study. So what my student, Matt Cronin, did was he went to the classroom that day and brought the pieces of paper and said, go ahead and solve these 4 questions. You come and bring it to me. As soon as you finish your questions correctly, you can leave. What better motivation for a student, right, than being able to leave the classroom on time. So they only needed 2 trials to be perfect at question 1 and 2, but the questions 3 and 4, this is the proportion of correct responses, okay? So it took 9 trials to reach about 80% correct. The rest, the other 20%, never did it correctly after 1 hour of being in the classroom. But something that this shows is learning. It shows that people are able, just with very basic feedback, correct, incorrect, they are able to go back and rethink and learn from their mistakes. What I think was most interesting is the demonstration of linear thinking. The main conclusion of that 2009 paper is that humans think linearly. So what we did was we designed different versions of the inflow and the outflow, and we asked people to draw the accumulation, just like in the other papers of Sweeney and Sterman. So I want you to see this because this is really striking, I think. So up here you see the inflow and the outflow. Here you see the correct answer. And here you see a typical example, okay? So inflow and outflow, the outflow in this case is greater than the inflow. What's gonna happen? Well, the stock is gonna decrease, and it's gonna decrease linearly. Instead, see what the majority of people answer, okay? And now see what is happening here, okay? This is the correct answer. This is what the majority of people answer. So they are copying the behavior of the stock, and they assume that the accumulation behaves the same way as the flows. This is the proportion of correct responses, and we cannot see very well, but that down there is the number of people that follow this heuristic. We ended up calling it the correlation heuristic. The other conclusion is that the more complex the relationship between the inflow and the outflow is, the more people follow the correlation heuristic, the more they rely on this copying behavior. And again, we cannot see. But a very large number of people were doing this copying behavior, the more complex the graphs were. So yeah, that has been very frustrating because it's not that we have solved the problem. We still don't solve that puzzle. This is just a list of all the different papers and research that has come out of the 2009 paper that I had with John and Matt. So we can see here, maybe explaining the source of the problem. We did this with people in medical students. Stephen Cantor was the dean of the medical school at Pitt, University of Pittsburgh. And we created different examples that medical students would know how to do, such as fluids in the body and things like that. And the results are the same. And all these are essentially demonstrations of the stock and flow failure and demonstrations of the linear thinking for people. Cognitive and behavioral accounts, we have been looking at these still. Other educational interventions, John Sterman swears that they work, but they don't quite work very successfully, just a little bit, individual differences, etc. So what is next? So these are, for those of you that would be interested in following this line of research, these are the kind of things I think we should be looking at. In particular, my student and I have been working on the use of simulations. So what we did is simply represent the stock as a bathtub. We can think of this as a bathtub. And it's a dynamic simulation. So here, basically, participants need to decide on how much to enter and how much to pull out of this bathtub in every trial over a long course of trials. And he actually did his dissertation on climate change and human misperceptions of climate change. So all his experiments were around CO2 accumulation, and this was the simulation that he used for his dissertation. In fact, the National Geographic some time ago demonstrated the accumulation of CO2 as a bathtub. And that's exactly right, to make it as simple as possible. Yet I don't think it has made a huge difference, but simplifying, I think, if I learned something in my career, is that complex problems are understood better when they are made simple for people. One of the things that John did with the CO2 accumulation, and this is a paper in Science, is demonstrate essentially this is the accumulation, here are the emissions, here are the removals. Tell me what the emissions should do in order to level out the CO2 accumulation. Guess what people most of the time did in this case? They increased the accumulations, which is totally counterproductive. The only way to level out the CO2 is when the emissions and the removals are the same. And instead, people threw the emissions up, imitating the accumulation. John and I have been working on different management flight simulators, he calls them. Mine are usually simple, but he has become actually quite sophisticated. At MIT, you can go and find out MIT Sloan, all these different simulations, all of them are based on the same principles of stocks and flows and accumulation. And that's all I have. Thank you.
¿Hacen ustedes la distinción entre primer orden y segundo orden en términos de, no sé si conoces el trabajo de von Foerster?
No lo conozco.
Pero von Foerster definió
Foerster? Yeah, Foerster, yes.
First order and second order cybernetics.
Sí.
Now, in the second order cybernetics, the problem is that the observer is within the system and is constructing the system. Now, the way that I saw you presenting here was that the observer was outside and the system was something that was being affected by the action as if it were an objective system.
That's interesting. I don't know. We can talk about how could we represent the system as a second order. I thought you were meaning acceleration and velocity.
Not in the physical sense, in the sense of the observer.
We should talk about how we could do that. We haven't done it.
I don't have presentation because I come from the field of system elements to etc. So it's very, very clear this presentation to make aware to the people this problem of perception. My question is, do you have some procedure to transmit that to the students? So besides demonstrating that this is so, besides demonstrating that this is difficult, etc., do you have some kind of materials to transmit it to the students? Because this would be convenient to all the students, no matter if they are in the Carnegie Mellon or MIT, etc., to grasp all these insights.
Yeah.
Do you have something, or just is a research?
So I started to teach a course that I called Dynamic Decisions 3 years ago. And one of the main problems is that all the material that I look for in, is available is very difficult for students to understand, especially undergraduate students. And for example, John has his famous book on business dynamics. I was able to use the first chapter, but the students are completely, it goes above my own capacity of explaining that. I think it's a very complex book, and I've told him that maybe you can use it for your students, but I cannot use it for undergraduates. So what I've been doing is from materials here and there in different places, trying to create my own course and my own examples. Forrester had the K-12 materials, which are for kids, but I think those actually work well for undergraduates to try to influence them in their nonlinear thinking and stocks and flows and general systems theory. What I also do is Vensim. I use Vensim PLE, and they end up doing relatively simple simulations, but I think the concept of feedback delay, for example, ends up being a lot clearer after they see simulations with Vensim. So I don't think that the way of teaching is just presenting the examples. I do that, but then when they start doing simulation with Vensim, that's when they really start to get it, I think.
And the beer game, you didn't try to use the beer game?
I do the beer game in the classroom, and in fact, everybody that comes to my lab needs to come to my house and play the beer game with beer, with real beer.
So this is...
Yeah, no, we actually have the board game. A long time ago, early 2000s, I developed actually a computer simulation of the beer game. My insight there, or my hypothesis was contrary to many people thinking that, this is a matter of coordination between the players. I was like, no, this has to be an individual issue. So I turned the beer game in that simulation into an individual simulation, and the other positions were played by bots, okay, by algorithms.
Yeah.
And in fact, what we found was this, effect, the bullwhip effect. Even though there is no coordination and there is no communication issues, this was one individual against bots, and still we replicated that. Furthermore, we actually were able to get rid of that oscillation by asking people to play the beer game multiple times. And what we saw is that people are able to control that bullwhip, okay? But then, there is a lot of stuff to do there too. But then the question became, are they memorizing the particular, schedule of the sales and supplies, or are they really learning dynamic systems? The question is memorization. So still, I think there is a very important open question is, are we able to really learn the dynamics of a system? And are we able to really transfer what we learn in one system to another? Up to now, I'm very pessimistic now, and I guess, like John, I always blame him for being too pessimistic, but after 10 years of working in these type of systems, I think I'm starting to believe him.